The soft blue glow of alien text scrolled across the laboratory view screen, casting eerie shadows across Captain Mara Heron's face. Her eyes, dark and focused, scanned the readouts with practiced efficiency. 9 years of xenobiological research had taught her to interpret the peculiar syntax of coalition scientific notation. But nothing in her training had prepared her for the data now flooding her terminal. "Impossible," she whispered, fingers tracing the energy signature of the human subject on the screen. "These levels can't be sustainable in any living organism." Lieutenant Rhea Kendis glanced up from her station across the sterile white lab. "Which batch is that from? The simulation projections or the actual blood work?" "Both," Mara replied, pushing a strand of copper hair behind her ear. "The simulations predicted elevated norepinephrine and cortisol. But this," she gestured at the glowing readout, "this is off any scale we've established. A synthetic cocktail this potent would kill most coalition species instantly." The laboratory, tucked deep within the Aurora's Edge frigate, hummed with the quiet efficiency of coalition technology. Beyond the reinforced viewport, the hollowed asteroid of Artaros 9 hung like a pockmarked skull against the starfield. Its jagged tunnels and chambers housed both their hopes and nightmares, a forward base against the chitterling horde and the grave of too many good soldiers, including Ellen. Mara's hand instinctively moved to the small metal tag hanging from a chain around her neck, her sister's identification, recovered from the massacre 6 months earlier. She pushed the memory away. Grief wouldn't help her mission now. "Captain," Rhea's voice cut through her thoughts. "Command wants your preliminary assessment within the hour." Mara nodded curtly. "Tell them I'm compiling it now, and inform Dr. Solvak I'll need full access to the human subjects for the demonstration tomorrow." "Already scheduled." Rhea's multi-jointed fingers tapped efficiently at her console. Unlike Mara, the lieutenant's silver-sheen skin and horizontal pupils marked her as Senrian, one of the founding species of the Coalition. "Though I should warn you, High Command is sending Observer Tall to evaluate your work personally." Mara's jaw tightened. "The War Minister's own attaché? Perfect." "The chitterlings broke through the Kelsian defense line yesterday. 3 colony domes lost." Rhea's voice remained even, professional, but her pupils contracted to thin slits, the Senrian equivalent of a grimace. "Command is desperate for any advantage." "And they think humans are it." Mara turned back to her screen, studying the chemical composition that defied conventional xenobiology. "Let's hope they're right." The corridor leading to the training compound stretched before her, antiseptic and cold. Coalition architecture favored function over comfort. All smooth surfaces and reinforced alloys designed to withstand the rigors of deep space and hostile environments. As Mara walked, her boots clicking against the polished floor, she mentally reviewed what she knew about their newest allies. Humans had only joined the Coalition 3 standard years ago, after chitterling scouts had been detected in their solar system. As a species, they were unremarkable at first glance. Bipedal mammals with moderate technological advancement and no natural defenses to speak of. What made them valuable were their adaptability and sheer numbers. Earth had billions of potential soldiers for a war that had already consumed millions of Coalition lives. What no one had anticipated, however, was the peculiar biochemistry that Mara now studied. Under extreme stress, particularly mortal danger, human bodies produced a natural cocktail of compounds that mimicked the most potent combat stimulants in the Coalition's arsenal, but with none of the usual side effects or dependencies. The training compound door hissed open as she approached. Inside, the facility had been designed to mimic the tunnels of Artaros 9. Low gravity, fluctuating atmosphere, and unpredictable terrain. A dozen human recruits stood at attention as she entered, their faces masked by standard-issue rebreathers. "At ease," she called, and the tension visibly drained from their postures. All except one, a tall, broad-shouldered man whose eyes remained fixed on the far wall, his body rigid with what Mara recognized as barely controlled fear. She consulted her datapad. "Private Ford?" He stepped forward, rebreather muffling his voice. "Yes, Captain. You'll be participating in the demonstration tomorrow. Report to medical for baseline readings at 0600. "Understood, ma'am." His voice was steady, but Mara could see the slight tremor in his hands, the early signs of the response they'd been studying. She hesitated, then added more softly, "It's a controlled environment, private. You're not in danger." Ford's eyes met hers, and in them she saw something that made her stomach twist. The look of someone who knew they were being lied to. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, but the tremor in his hands didn't subside. As Mara turned to leave, Specialist Hioki approached, his translucent membrane fluttering with the subtle patterns that served as his species' primary mode of communication. The linguist's vocalization unit hummed to life. "The recruits are adapting well to the atmospheric conditions." Hioki's synthesized voice remarked, "Particularly Subject Ford. His lung capacity exceeds our initial projections by 17%. Mara glanced back at the private, who had rejoined the others for instruction. "What's his background?" "Farmer. Topeka repair yard. No military experience before conscription." Hioki's membrane flickered with what Mara had learned to interpret as confusion. "An unremarkable specimen, by human standards, which makes his physiological responses all the more interesting." "Has he been told what tomorrow entails?" "Only that it's a standard stress evaluation." The membrane stilled momentarily. "You disapprove?" Mara kept her expression neutral. "It's not my place to approve or disapprove, Specialist. I'm here to observe and record." "Of course, Captain." Hioki's tone held no judgment, but his membrane pulsed with a pattern Mara recognized as skepticism. "Though I wonder if your interest in Subject Ford has personal dimensions. His genetic profile shows similarities to—" "That will be all, Specialist." Mara cut him off sharply. "Prepare the demonstration parameters as discussed. I want everything ready for Command's inspection." She left before Hioki could respond, her steps quicker than necessary. The Specialist wasn't wrong. Jace Ford's file had caught her attention precisely because of those genetic markers. So similar to Elin's. It was a coincidence, nothing more. But in a war where she'd already lost so much, coincidences felt weighted with meaning. Back in her quarters, Mara reviewed her findings for the 100th time. The data was undeniable. Human fight-or-flight responses produced chemical compounds that enhanced strength, speed, and reaction time far beyond their baseline capabilities. In the most extreme cases, they rivaled the performance of elite coalition warriors with decades of combat enhancement. The potential was staggering. If they could isolate and replicate the triggers for this response, or better yet, extract and synthesize the compounds directly, they might finally have a weapon that could turn the tide against the chitterlings. But as she stared at Private Ford's medical scans, a different thought nagged at her. The Coalition had encountered over 30 sentient species in its history, and none had evolved quite like humans, with such a dramatic internal response to threat. What did that say about Earth? That its dominant species had developed such an extreme survival mechanism? And what would it mean to weaponize it? Her terminal chimed softly, interrupting her thoughts. A message from High Command. Observer Tall had arrived early and requested an immediate preliminary briefing. Mara sighed, closing Ford's file. The politics of war waited for no one, not even science. The observation deck overlooking the training compound was crowded with Coalition officers when Mara arrived. At their center stood Observer Tall, his exoskeleton gleaming with the polished insignia of the War Ministry. The Thracian's compound eyes swiveled toward her as she entered, facets glinting in the artificial light. "Captain Heron, Tall's mandibles clicked softly as he spoke. Your reports have generated considerable interest. Show us these remarkable humans in action. Mara inclined her head respectfully. Of course, observer. We've prepared a demonstration that should illustrate their unique capabilities under controlled stress conditions. Below them, the training compound had been reconfigured to resemble a narrow tunnel junction, similar to those in the Artaros 9 network. Private Ford stood alone at one end, equipped with standard coalition armor, but notably lacking any weapons. At Mara's signal, Hioki activated the environmental controls, dropping the temperature and reducing visibility with a fine mist that mimicked the toxic atmosphere of the deeper tunnels. Subject Ford has no combat training beyond the basic 8-week coalition course, Mara explained. He's been informed this is a routine survival drill, navigating from point A to point B, while avoiding simulated hazards. And the actual parameters? Dr. Solvak inquired, his elongated fingers tapping restlessly against the viewing glass. The chief bioengineer had been skeptical of Mara's research from the beginning, preferring his synthetic combat enhancers to what he called primitive evolutionary responses. He will encounter a live chitterling patrol, Mara replied evenly, ignoring the ripple of surprise that passed through the observers. Captured specimens, modified with neural inhibitors to prevent lethal force, but otherwise fully functional. Solvak's eyes narrowed. You're putting an unarmed recruit against combat-ready chitterlings? Without warning him? That's precisely the point. Doctor, the biochemical response we're studying only manifests fully under genuine threat conditions. Simulations produce only partial results. Observer Tail's mandibles clattered in what might have been approval. Proceed, Captain. Below, Ford moved cautiously through the artificial tunnel, his rebreather mask obscuring his expression. He carried himself well, Mara noted, alert but not panicked, using cover effectively as he'd been taught. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then, at a signal from Hioki, a panel in the far wall slid open. The chitterling patrol emerged silently. 3 sleek, chitinous forms with articulated limbs and the distinctive lithium armor plating that made them so difficult to kill. Even with neural inhibitors, they moved with predatory grace, sensing the human's presence immediately. Ford froze, then scrambled backward, looking frantically for an exit, finding none. He pressed himself against the wall, eyes wide behind his mask. The lead chitterling advanced, its serrated forelimbs extended in the characteristic pre-attack posture. Vital signs accelerating rapidly, Rhea reported from her monitoring station. Adrenal markers spiking, respiratory rate at 157% of baseline. Mara watched intently as Ford's posture changed, subtle at first, then dramatically. His trembling stopped, his shoulders squared, and then, as the lead chitterling lunged, something remarkable happened. Ford moved, not with the desperate flailing of a cornered victim, but with the fluid precision of a predator. He ducked under the chitterling's first strike and drove his elbow up into a joint between armor plates, a vulnerability that shouldn't have been obvious to an untrained eye. The creature staggered, its neural inhibitor preventing it from using its full strength, but still dangerous. The second chitterling circled, attempting to flank him. Ford grabbed a length of broken conduit from the tunnel floor and swung it with such force that it cracked against the creature's carapace, sending it reeling backward. Incredible, Dr. Solvak murmured, professional skepticism momentarily forgotten. Look at his speed. Adrenal output now at 329% of baseline, Rhea continued, her voice tight with controlled excitement. Muscle efficiency at peak capacity. He's burning energy at an unsustainable rate, but compensating with... She trailed off as Ford engaged the third chitterling directly, somehow anticipating its movement patterns and countering with brutal efficiency. Within moments, all 3 alien soldiers lay incapacitated, their neural systems temporarily overloaded. Ford stood in the center of the chamber, chest heaving, the metal conduit still clutched in white-knuckled hands. Blood trickled from several shallow cuts on his arms and face, injuries he seemed completely unaware of. "End simulation," Mara ordered, and the lights in the training compound brightened to standard levels. Medical personnel rushed in to secure the chitterlings and attend to Ford, who had begun to sway on his feet as the biochemical surge ebbed. Observer Tal's compound eyes fixed on Mara. "You've made your point, Captain. Most impressive." "This is only the beginning," she replied, gesturing to the data streaming across her pad. "With proper study, we believe we can isolate the specific triggers and chemical pathways that enable this response, potentially even replicate it for wider application." "How soon?" Tal demanded. Mara hesitated. "That depends on how quickly we can move to the next phase of testing. We need more subjects, more controlled exposures to—" "You'll have whatever you require," Tal interrupted. "Dr. Solvac will assist with the biochemical analysis. I want preliminary synthesis attempts within 2 standard weeks." Solvac straightened, clearly pleased at being brought into the project. "We'll need the human transferred to the main laboratory immediately. Full invasive monitoring will be necessary to map the neural adrenal pathways." Something cold settled in Mara's stomach. "Invasive monitoring has risks, especially when we're still learning about human physiology. I recommend we continue with non-invasive approaches first." "Your concerns are noted, Captain," Tal cut her off. "But time is a luxury we no longer possess. The chitterling queen has accelerated her breeding cycle. Intelligence suggests a major offensive within the month." The observer turned to leave, adding over his shoulder, "Full research authority is transferred to Dr. Solvac, effective immediately. You will continue as xenobiological consultant, but defer to his experimental protocols." After the others had filed out, Rhea approached Mara, keeping her voice low. "This isn't right. They're treating Ford like a laboratory specimen, not a coalition soldier." "That's exactly what he is to them," Mara replied bitterly. "What all humans are. Walking combat drug factories." She stared down at the training compound, where medics were helping an exhausted Ford onto a stretcher. "And now I've handed them the proof they needed." "You were following orders," Rhea said, placing a 6-fingered hand briefly on Mara's shoulder. "So were the Kelsians who led their colonies into chitterling traps." Mara pulled away. "Find out where they're taking Ford. I want to monitor his condition personally." Rhea's pupils contracted with concern. "Captain, if Solvac discovers you interfering with his protocols, then he'll have to explain to Command why he allowed their valuable test subject to suffer neural collapse from improper post-stress management." Mara gathered her data pads. "I know human physiology better than anyone on this ship. Solvac may have authority, but I have expertise. And right now, that gives me just enough leverage to ensure Private Ford doesn't become another casualty of coalition pragmatism." The medical bay aboard the Aurora's Edge was designed for efficiency rather than comfort. Private Jace Ford lay on an examination platform, surrounded by monitoring equipment that hummed and chirped with alien rhythms. His skin was pale beneath the harsh lighting, dark circles shadowing his eyes. When Mara entered, he attempted to sit up, only to be restrained by the monitoring leads attached to his chest and temples. "At ease, Private," she said, approaching his bedside. "How are you feeling?" Ford's laugh was hollow. "Like I got hit by a tractor, ma'am," then backed over a few times for good measure. His eyes, bloodshot but alert, studied her face. "That wasn't a simulation, was it? Those were actual chitterlings." Mara considered lying, then thought better of it. "Yes, captured specimens with neural inhibitors to prevent lethal force. Didn't feel very inhibited from where I was standing." He flexed his right hand, wincing at what must have been considerable pain. "Did I pass your test?" "With flying colors." Mara checked his vitals on the nearest display. His biochemistry was still adjusting. Adrenal system, slowly returning to baseline. Do you remember what happened in there? Ford's brow furrowed. Pieces. I remember being scared out of my mind when those things came at me. Then everything gets fuzzy, like I was watching myself from somewhere else. He looked up at her, confusion evident in his expression. They say I took down 3 of them. That can't be right. The recordings confirm it. Mara pulled up the footage on her datapad, showing him the blur of motion that had been his body moving with impossible speed and precision. Ford stared at the screen in disbelief. That's not me. I've never fought anything in my life. Before being shipped out here, the most violent thing I'd ever done was put down a sick horse. It was you, Mara assured him. Your body produced a natural chemical response to extreme threat, what humans sometimes call fight or flight. In your case, definitely fight. So I got lucky, Ford muttered, looking away from the footage. Not luck. Biology. Mara set down the pad. Your body synthesized compounds more potent than our best combat stimulants, allowing you to access physical capabilities far beyond your normal limits. That's why you feel so drained now. You essentially ran a metabolic marathon in 3 minutes. Ford processed this information in silence. Finally, he asked, "What happens now?" Mara hesitated. Coalition protocol dictated full disclosure only to those with sufficient security clearance, which Ford, as a standard recruit, certainly didn't have. But something about his direct gaze, about the way he'd fought so desperately to survive a threat he hadn't been prepared for, compelled her honesty. Dr. Solvak, our chief bioengineer, will conduct further tests to understand exactly how your body produces these compounds. They hope to synthesize them eventually, create a combat drug based on your natural chemistry. To give to other soldiers? Ford asked. That's the idea. He nodded slowly. Good, if it helps stop those things. He trailed off, then asked, How many tests? Mara looked away. I don't know. As many as they need. Will they hurt? The question hung in the air between them. Mara thought of Solvak's invasive monitoring protocols, of the neural mapping that would require direct stimulation of Ford's fear centers while in restraints. I'll do everything I can to ensure they don't, she said finally, knowing it was both a promise and a lie. Ford seemed to sense the evasion. His eyes hardened slightly, but he merely nodded. When do we start? Tomorrow. For now, you need rest. Your body requires time to readjust after such an extreme chemical surge. As she turned to leave, Ford called after her. Captain, those things, the chitterlings. I've heard stories about what they did to the Kelsian colonies, to coalition troops on Artaros 9. Mara stopped, her hand on the door panel. What about them? Are the stories true? She thought of Ellen, of the mission recordings they'd recovered along with her ID tag, of the sounds no sentient being should ever make. Yes, she said quietly. They're true. Ford was silent for a long moment. Then, I'm ready to do whatever it takes, Captain. If what's in my blood can help stop them, it's worth a few tests. Mara left without responding, the weight of his willing sacrifice sitting like lead in her stomach. She had no doubt Ford meant every word, and equally little doubt that his courage would be repaid with suffering beyond anything he could imagine. The laboratory assigned to Dr. Solvak for the Human Enhancement Project occupied an entire deck of the Aurora's Edge. When Mara arrived the next morning, she found it transformed. New equipment had been installed overnight, and a team of coalition specialists worked at various stations, analyzing data and preparing test protocols. Solvak himself stood at the central console, his elongated fingers dancing across the interface with practiced precision. He acknowledged Mara with a curt nod. Captain Heron, I've reviewed your preliminary findings. Fascinating work, though methodologically limited. Mara ignored the criticism. Where is Private Ford? Preparation chamber. Solvak gestured toward a sealed door at the far end of the lab. We're establishing baseline readings before the first test sequence. What protocols are you planning to implement? Solvak's thin lips curved into what might have generously been called a smile. Direct neural stimulation of the amygdala and hypothalamus, coupled with controlled environmental stressors. We need to map precisely which threat stimuli produce the optimal chemical response. Direct stimulation carries significant risks in human subjects, Mara cautioned. Their neural architecture isn't designed for... I've made adjustments for human physiology, Solvak interrupted dismissively. The risk is acceptable given the potential rewards. I'd like to review your protocols before implementation. Solvak finally looked up from his console, eyes narrowing. That won't be necessary, Captain. Observer Tal was quite clear about the chain of authority here. As xenobiological consultant, I have a responsibility to... Your responsibility, Solvak cut in sharply, is to provide information when requested, not to interfere with my research methodology. His voice softened slightly, taking on an almost patronizing tone. I understand your concern for the subject. It's natural to develop a certain attachment when working closely with specimens. But remember, Private Ford volunteered for coalition service knowing the risks. He volunteered to fight, not to be a laboratory experiment, Mara replied, keeping her voice level with effort. In this war, Captain, they are one and the same. Solvak returned his attention to his console. Now, if you'll excuse me, we're about to begin. You're welcome to observe from the monitoring station, but please refrain from further interruptions. Mara retreated to the designated observation area, fury simmering beneath her professional demeanor. Through the transparent partition, she could see Ford being prepared for the procedure. Electrodes attached to his temples, intravenous lines inserted into his arms to collect real-time blood samples during stimulation. He caught her eye through the partition and gave a small nod that might have been meant as reassurance. Mara forced herself to nod back, though the gesture felt hollow. What followed over the next several hours was methodical, clinical, and increasingly difficult to watch. Solvak's team subjected Ford to carefully calibrated fear responses, first through neural stimulation alone, then combined with environmental factors, sound, light, temperature, and finally, visual stimuli showing chitterling attack footage. Each time, they pushed further, holding him at the edge of terror while extracting blood samples and neural readings. Each time, Ford's body responded with the remarkable chemical surge they sought to understand. And each time, the recovery period grew longer, his system clearly straining under the repeated stress. By the 6th hour, Mara could no longer remain silent. When Ford's vital signs began showing dangerous instability during a particularly intense stimulation sequence, she overrode the observation room communications. Dr. Solvak, you need to terminate this session immediately. His adrenal system is approaching critical fatigue. Solvak glanced irritably at the interruption. We're nearly complete with this sequence. The data will be useless if he suffers systemic collapse, Mara snapped. Look at his cortisol levels. No human body can sustain that kind of output without serious consequences. A tense silence followed as Solvak reviewed the readings. Finally, with obvious reluctance, he signaled to his team. Terminate sequence. Prepare subject for recovery protocols. As the stimulation ended, Ford's body went limp on the examination platform, consciousness fading as his overtaxed system shut down to protect itself. Medical technicians moved in immediately, administering stabilizers and monitoring his transition to normal function. Solvak approached the observation area, his expression tight with controlled anger. That intervention was unnecessary, Captain. We had the situation well within acceptable parameters. Your acceptable parameters nearly caused permanent adrenal damage, Mara replied, gesturing to the readings still displayed on the monitors. You're pushing too hard, too fast. The human system requires recovery time between stress events of this magnitude. We don't have the luxury of time, as Observer Tall made quite clear. Solvak's voice lowered. Perhaps your judgment is compromised by personal factors? I understand you lost a sister to the chitterlings. That kind of trauma can affect one's professional objectivity. Mara felt cold rage wash through her, but kept her expression neutral. My concern is purely scientific. Doctor, if you burn out your test subject, your research fails. It's that simple. Solvak studied her for a moment, then nodded curtly. Very well. We'll implement a 12-hour recovery period before resuming tests. Will that satisfy your scientific concerns? 24 would be more appropriate, given today's stress levels. 18, Solvak countered. And, in the meantime, I expect your full cooperation in analyzing the data we've collected. Perhaps together we can refine the protocols to be more efficient. It was a concession, if a small one. Mara nodded her agreement, knowing it was the best she could achieve for now. As Solvak walked away, Rhea approached from her monitoring station, voice low. That was risky, Captain. Solvak has Observer Tall's full confidence. Solvak is brilliant but reckless, Mara replied. He's so focused on replicating the chemical response that he's ignoring the holistic nature of human physiology. She watched as Ford was moved to a recovery chamber. I need to speak with Private Ford alone, as soon as he's conscious. Rhea's pupils contracted with concern. Captain, that would directly violate Solvak's research protocols. He's ordered isolation during recovery periods to prevent emotional contamination of the subject. Then don't log it, Mara said simply. Medical privacy protocols still apply, even to test subjects. I need 5 minutes for a standard psychological evaluation, completely routine for humans under stress. Rhea hesitated, then nodded, almost imperceptibly. I'll notify you when he regains consciousness. But, Captain, she paused. Be careful. Solvak isn't the only one watching this project closely. 3 hours later, Mara stood by Ford's recovery bed, having used her medical override to gain access to his chamber. He was awake, but groggy, the cocktail of stress hormones and subsequent stabilizers leaving him disoriented. Captain, he murmured, attempting to focus on her face. Did I pass the test? You did fine, she assured him, checking that the room's monitoring systems were in privacy mode. But I need to ask you something important, and I need an honest answer. Ford blinked, struggling to clear his mind. Go ahead. How much more of this can you take? He seemed surprised by the question. Whatever's necessary, ma'am. You said yourself, what's in my blood could help win this war. That's not what I asked. Mara leaned closer, lowering her voice. The procedures will only get more invasive from here. Solvak is determined to isolate the exact neural pathways that trigger your adrenal response, and he's not concerned about the toll it takes on you. Ford was silent for a moment, processing this information. You're asking if I want out. I'm asking how much more your body and mind can endure, Mara corrected. Because I've seen what happens when human physiology is pushed beyond its limits, and it's not something that can be fixed with medical technology. And if I say I'm reaching my limit? What then? Ford's eyes had cleared somewhat, his gaze direct. I'm still coalition property, aren't I? A resource to be used where needed. The bitter truth of his assessment hung between them. Mara couldn't deny it. By coalition law, all soldiers were indeed military resources first, individuals second. There are alternatives, she said finally. Less invasive research methods that might take longer, but would be more sustainable. If I had evidence that the current protocols were causing permanent damage. You want me to lie? Ford interrupted. Claim I'm breaking down when I'm not. No. Mara shook her head. I want you to be honest about your limits before they're reached. Not after. Because once they're crossed, Solvak won't stop. he'll simply move on to the next human subject. Ford considered this, then asked quietly, "Why do you care what happens to me, Captain? I'm just one soldier." Mara hesitated, unsure herself why she'd risked her position to intervene. Was it just because he reminded her of Aelin somehow? Or was it something more fundamental? A recognition that in their rush to weaponize humanity's unique biology, they were losing sight of what made it valuable in the first place? Because treating people like disposable resources is exactly what the chitterlings do, she said finally. And I didn't join this fight to become what we're fighting against. Ford held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I'll tell you the truth. Then, today was bad. Worse than I let on. There were moments when I couldn't remember my own name. Couldn't remember anything except the need to fight or run. He swallowed hard. If that's what happens every time, I don't know how many more sessions I can handle before something breaks permanently. Thank you for your honesty, Mara said, relief and concern mingling in her voice. Rest now. I'll work on finding an alternative approach. As she turned to leave, Ford caught her wrist with surprising strength. Captain, whatever you're planning, be careful. I've seen how the officers look at you, like you're not quite one of them anymore. Like maybe you've spent too much time with humans. Mara gently extracted her wrist from his grip. Get some sleep, private. That's an order. She left the recovery chamber, her mind racing with possibilities and dangers. Ford was right. Her advocacy for human subjects had already marked her as potentially compromised in the eyes of Coalition Command. Any direct challenge to Solvak's authority would likely end her career, if not worse. But there might be another way, one that would require significant risk, but could potentially save Ford and redirect the research toward more sustainable methods. She needed more information, more leverage, and for that, she needed help from someone who understood the politics of coalition research better than anyone else aboard the Aurora's Edge. She found specialist Hioki in the ship's xenolinguistics lab, his translucent membrane rippling with complex patterns as he studied chitterling communication recordings. He acknowledged her presence with a subtle shift in coloration, the equivalent of a nod among his species. Captain Heron, you seek information about Dr. Solvak's true objectives. Mara didn't bother asking how he knew. Hioki's species were renowned for their ability to read behavioral cues across species barriers. Is it that obvious? Only to those who pay attention to the currents beneath official discourse. Hioki's vocalization unit hummed softly. You should know that Solvak has reported your excessive concern for the human subject. Observer Tal has noted it in your file. Of course he has, Mara sighed, leaning against a nearby console. What's Solvak really after? Hioki. This can't just be about creating better combat drugs. We already have those. Hioki's membrane stilled in the pattern that indicated careful consideration. You are correct. Solvak's interest extends beyond mere chemical replication. A pause. Then, he believes the human adrenal response may be the key to solving the Coalition's most persistent tactical disadvantage. Which is? Time. Hioki's membrane rippled. Specifically, reaction time. Coalition neural architecture, across all member species, processes threat response through multiple pathways. Deliberative, measured, precise. Human architecture bypasses these pathways entirely under extreme stress, creating what might be called instinctive genius. Mara frowned. You're talking about Ford's ability to identify chitterling weak points without training. Precisely. When the human biochemical surge occurs, it creates a temporary state of heightened threat recognition and response calibration that no coalition species can match naturally. Solvak doesn't merely want to replicate the chemicals. He wants to map and potentially transfer the neural architecture that enables them to work so effectively. The implications hit Mara like a physical blow. That's not possible. Neural architecture is species-specific. You can't just transfer it. With conventional technology, no. Hioki's membrane flickered, with patterns too complex for Mara to interpret. But Solvac has been experimenting with chitterling neural control mechanisms, the same technology they use to coordinate their hive attacks. He believes it may be possible to create a hybrid system. Using humans as the template, Mara concluded, the full horror of Solvac's vision becoming clear. That's why the invasive monitoring, the direct neural stimulation. He's not just studying Ford's response, he's mapping his entire threat recognition system. Correct. Hioki's vocalization hummed with what might have been concern. The procedure would not be survivable for the template subject. Cold fury washed through Mara. Why are you telling me this, Hioki? You're risking your position by sharing classified research objectives. The linguist's membrane stilled completely, a rare expression of absolute certainty among his kind. Because I have observed both coalition and human approaches to warfare. The coalition fights with technology and numbers. Humans fight with something else, something we do not fully understand, but should not destroy in our attempt to harness it. He moved toward the door, pausing to add, "There is a transmission arriving at 2200 hours tonight. New orders regarding the Artaros 9 offensive. I believe you will find it illuminating. The encryption key is in your sister's service record." Before Mara could ask what he meant, Hioki was gone, leaving her with more questions than answers, but also with the first glimmer of a plan. That night, secluded in her quarters with security protocols engaged, Mara accessed the Coalition communication array using her officer's clearance. The transmission Hioki had mentioned arrived precisely on schedule. A heavily encrypted tactical update from Coalition High Command to Observer Tal. The encryption was military-grade, designed to resist even the most sophisticated chitterling interception attempts. But Hioki had given her a key, something in Elan's service record. Mara pulled up the file, scanning through the standard military data until she found it. The deployment codes for Elan's final mission, a sequence that would have been unique to her unit and known only to high-level command. It worked. The transmission unfolded before her, revealing the truth Hioki had wanted her to see. The Coalition wasn't planning a standard offensive on Artaros 9. They were preparing for a desperate, all-or-nothing strike at the chitterling Queen's Chamber, the heart of the hive, and the source of the endless waves of soldiers that had been overwhelming Coalition forces for years. And they planned to use Solvac's human-derived neural technology to do it. The strike team would be equipped with prototype neural enhancers, based on the research from Ford and other human test subjects, allowing them to anticipate and counter chitterling defenses with the same instinctive precision Ford had demonstrated. It was a bold plan, potentially war-ending if successful. It was also scheduled to deploy in just 3 days, far sooner than Solvac could possibly have a working prototype ready, without accelerating his research to dangerous levels. Unless he already had the technology prepared before Ford ever stepped into that training compound. Unless Ford had never been the first test subject at all. With growing dread, Mara dug deeper into the transmission, finding attached medical files that confirmed her worst fears. 3 human subjects had already undergone the complete neural mapping procedure Hioki had described. All 3 had suffered catastrophic neural collapse afterward. All 3 had been classified as combat casualties in official records. And Jace Ford was scheduled to be the 4th, immediately after tomorrow's final test sequence. Mara closed the files, her hands shaking with rage and horror. The Coalition, her Coalition, had been deliberately sacrificing human soldiers to develop this technology, all while maintaining the fiction of ethical research protocols and volunteer test subjects. She had 3 options: follow orders and allow Ford to be sacrificed for a technology that might end the war, report the illegal research to Coalition ethics authorities, who would take months to investigate while the war continued to claim millions of lives, or take direct action to stop Solvak's experiment before it claimed Ford's life. The choice was clear. Even if the path forward was fraught with danger, she would need help, resources, and perfect timing, and she would need to move quickly before Solvak realized she had discovered his true agenda. First, she needed an ally within the medical division, someone with access to the stabilizing compounds that would be essential for her plan. Lieutenant Rhea was the obvious choice, but involving her meant asking her to risk her career and possibly her freedom. Mara sent a carefully coded message requesting a meeting in the ship's arboretum, one of the few places aboard the Aurora's Edge where surveillance was minimal due to the interference from alien plant life. Rhea was waiting when Mara arrived, her silver skin luminescent in the soft biolights that nourished the exotic vegetation. "This is unorthodox, Captain. I assume it concerns Private Ford?" "It concerns all of us." Mara led her deeper into the arboretum, where the dense foliage would muffle their conversation. "I need to know where you stand, Rhea. Not as my lieutenant, but as someone who took an oath to uphold coalition medical ethics." Rhea's pupils contracted to thin slits. "You've discovered something. Solvak isn't developing combat drugs. He's mapping human neural architecture to create a hybrid interface, one that will burn out the human subject's mind in the process." Mara explained what she had learned, watching as Rhea's professional composure gave way to growing horror. "3 subjects already," Rhea whispered when Mara had finished. "And they listed them as combat deaths?" "Standard procedure for classified operations," Mara confirmed grimly. "Ford is next, scheduled for tomorrow after what Solvak is calling the final calibration test. But the technology can't possibly be ready. The neural integration alone would require months of—" Rhea stopped, realization dawning. "Unless they never intended it to be stable. They're planning a suicide mission." Mara nodded. "One-way neural enhancers. The strike team deploys with the technology, gains the combat advantage long enough to reach the Queen's chamber, and completes the mission before neural collapse occurs." "And what do you intend to do with this information, Captain?" Rhea's voice had grown carefully neutral, her military training reasserting itself. "I'm going to stop it," Mara said simply. "Not the mission. That needs to happen. But Solvak's approach is unnecessarily brutal. There's another way to achieve the same combat advantage without sacrificing human lives." "How?" Fear inducers." Mara pulled up schematics on her datapad. "Controlled doses of synthetic compounds that trigger the human fight or flight response without the neural mapping. It won't be as precise as Solvak's technology, but it will give the strike team the edge they need, and they'll survive to tell about it." Rhea studied the schematics, her scientific training evident in her quick analysis. "It could work, but Solvak would never agree to such a last-minute change in approach. That's why we're not going to ask him." Mara's voice hardened. "I need access to the medical supply vault, specifically the fear inducer compounds used in coalition psychological training, and I need your help administering them to Ford and myself during tomorrow's test." "Yourself?" Rhea's pupils dilated in shock. "Captain, you can't possibly—" "I'm going with Ford," Mara interrupted. "If we can demonstrate that the fear inducer approach works in an actual combat situation, Solvak will have no choice but to consider it for the mission." "And how do you plan to arrange this combat situation?" Rhea asked. "Solvak controls all access to the training compound." Mara's expression was grim. "We won't need to arrange it. According to the transmission I intercepted, Chitterling forces have already breached the outer tunnels of Artaros 9. By tomorrow, they'll be approaching the secondary defense perimeter, right where the laboratory level connects to the asteroid." Understanding dawned in Rhea's eyes. "You're planning to use the actual invasion as your demonstration?" "It's the only way to prove the concept quickly enough to save Ford and potentially improve the strike team's chances," Mara confirmed. "But I'll need your help to get the compounds and to ensure Ford is ready when the moment comes." Rhea was silent for a long moment, weighing duty against ethics, career against conscience. Finally, she nodded. "I'll help you, Captain. But you should know, Observer Tall has scheduled an inspection of the laboratory tomorrow. If he's present when you make your move, then we'll have the perfect audience for our demonstration," Mara finished. "Get some rest, Lieutenant. Tomorrow we'll test all of us." The next morning, the laboratory hummed with tense activity as Solvak's team prepared for what they were calling the final calibration sequence. Ford had been brought in under heavy sedation, his body still recovering from the previous day's tests, but deemed stable enough for the procedure that would map his neural pathways in their entirety. Observer Tal stood at the main console with Solvak, reviewing the test protocols with evident satisfaction. Neither of them paid much attention to Mara as she moved through the laboratory, ostensibly checking xenobiological readings, but actually confirming the positions of security personnel and emergency exits. Rhea entered with a medical cart, nodding almost imperceptibly to Mara as she began preparing the standard stabilizing compounds for the procedure. Beneath them, hidden in a secondary compartment, were the fear-inducer vials they would need for their plan. The timing would be critical. According to the security alerts Mara had been monitoring, Chitterling forces had indeed breached the outer defenses of Artaros 9 during the night. Coalition troops were engaged in holding actions throughout the tunnel network, but intelligence suggested a concentrated push toward the laboratory level within the next few hours. Their window would be narrow. They needed the Chitterlings close enough to provide a real combat scenario, but not so close that evacuation would be impossible afterward. As Solvak began the final preparations, Mara moved to Rhea's station, positioning herself to block the view of the security cameras. "Status?" she murmured, pretending to review data on a nearby screen. "Compounds ready," Rhea replied softly. "Ford's sedation is wearing off as scheduled. But Captain, the Chitterling advance is progressing faster than expected. Defense Level 3 has already been breached." Mara tensed. Level 3 was just 2 sections away from the laboratory. How long? 30 minutes, maybe less, before they reach the section. Not enough time for their original plan, which had called for a controlled confrontation in one of the outer corridors. They would have to adapt. New plan, Mara decided. When the alarm sounds for Level 4 breach, that's our signal. Inject Ford first, then me. We'll use the evacuation chaos to demonstrate the effectiveness of the fear inducers against the Chitterling advance. Rhea's pupils contracted with concern. That's significantly more dangerous, Captain. If the Chitterlings break through in force, then we'll have an even more compelling demonstration, Mara replied grimly. Just be ready. She moved away as Solvak approached Ford's examination platform, now preparing to initiate the neural mapping sequence that would, unknown to Ford, destroy his mind in the process of copying its architecture. Begin initial stimulation, Solvak ordered, and a technician activated the neural interface connected to Ford's temples. Ford's body tensed immediately, his face contorting in pain as the interface began its invasive scan of his brain's threat response centers. Mara forced herself to watch, counting the minutes until the perimeter alarm would give them their opening. She didn't have to wait long. Just as Solvak was preparing to move to the second phase of the mapping procedure, the laboratory's emergency system blared to life, a pulsing, high-pitched wail that signified perimeter breach at Level 4. Status report, Observer Tall demanded, his compound eyes swiveling toward the security display. Chitterling forces have broken through Defense Level 4, a security officer reported, voice tight with controlled panic. Estimated 40 to 50 combat units advancing toward the laboratory section. Evacuation order in effect for all non-essential personnel. Solvak looked up from his console, visibly annoyed at the interruption. Secure the subject for transport. We'll continue the procedure aboard the frigate. Belay that, Mara called out, moving quickly toward Ford's platform. We have a tactical opportunity here. Observer Tail turned toward her, mandibles clicking in irritation. "Explain yourself, Captain." "The fear-inducer protocol I proposed," Mara said, injecting authority into her voice. "We can test it now, in actual combat conditions. If it works, it could be implemented immediately for the strike team. No need for further neural mapping." "Absurd," Solvac snapped. "Your chemical approach lacks the precision of the neural interface. It would be a step backward in a procedure that has already failed 3 times, Mara interrupted, watching Tal's compound eyes widen at her knowledge of the classified information. "Yes, observer. I know about the previous subjects, and I know about the suicide mission you're planning." Tal's mandibles clattered in what might have been anger or surprise. "How did you—" Another alarm cut him off, this one more urgent, signaling imminent breach of the laboratory level itself. "We don't have time to debate," Mara pressed. "Let me demonstrate the fear-inducer approach now, against actual chitterlings. If it fails, you've lost nothing but a few minutes. If it succeeds, you have a viable alternative that won't burn out your strike team before they reach the Queen's chamber." Tal and Solvac exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Finally, Tal nodded sharply. "You have 5 minutes, Captain. Demonstrate your alternative or evacuate with the rest of the non-essential personnel." It was all the authorization Mara needed. She signaled to Rhea, who moved forward with the medical cart, quickly disconnecting Ford from the neural interface and injecting him with the fear-inducer compound before anyone could object. "What are you doing?" Ford gasped as the sedation faded, replaced by the artificial stimulation of his adrenal system. "Saving your life," Mara replied quietly, then added in a louder voice. "Preparing the subject for combat demonstration." Rhea handed her a second injector, which Mara immediately pressed to her own neck, wincing as the compound entered her bloodstream. Almost instantly, she felt its effects, a rush of hyper-awareness, her senses sharpening painfully as her body flooded with artificial fear response chemicals. "Captain Heron," Solvac protested, "you haven't been cleared for combat stimulants. The interaction with your physiology could—" "I've studied human biochemistry more thoroughly than anyone in this room." Mara cut him off, fighting to keep her voice steady as the chemicals surged through her system. "I know exactly what I'm doing." The laboratory doors slammed shut automatically as the security system detected approaching hostiles. Through the reinforced viewport, they could see coalition soldiers retreating down the corridor, exchanging fire with the advancing chitterling force. "All personnel, prepare for defensive positions," Tal ordered, his military training taking precedence over scientific concerns. "Security team, establish a perimeter around the evacuation route." As the laboratory staff scrambled to comply, Mara helped Ford to his feet. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated from the fear-inducer, but his movements were steady, controlled despite the artificial panic coursing through his system. "Follow my lead," she told him, grabbing a standard-issue sidearm from a nearby security station and handing it to him before taking one for herself. "Remember your training compound performance. Your body knows what to do. Just let it happen." Ford nodded, his breathing rapid but regular, already adapting to the chemical surge in ways that proved Mara's theory about sustainable human response. The viewport shattered inward as a chitterling soldier hurled itself against the reinforced material, its serrated limbs leaving deep gouges in the supposedly impenetrable barrier. More followed, their chitinous bodies flowing through the breach like a nightmare tide. "Now, Private," Mara called, and stepped forward to meet them, feeling her own body respond to the fear-inducer in ways both terrifying and exhilarating. The world seemed to slow around her, each movement of the approaching chitterlings visible in excruciating detail, the flex of jointed limbs, the acidic gleam of compound eyes, the vibration of sensory antennae as they detected human prey. She fired her weapon with a precision that surprised even herself, each shot finding vulnerable joints between armor plates. Beside her, Ford moved with the same fluid grace he had shown in the training compound, but now with purpose and control, not the blind panic of his first encounter. Together, they created a deadly choreography, anticipating the chitterlings' movements and countering with devastating efficiency. What should have been a hopeless last stand became an improbable holding action, giving the laboratory staff precious time to evacuate through the secondary exits. Observer Tal watched from behind a security barricade, his compound eyes fixed on the human performance with undisguised amazement. Even Solvak had fallen silent, his scientific skepticism momentarily overcome by the evidence before him. "The tunnel!" Rhea shouted suddenly, pointing to a maintenance access in the laboratory floor, a direct connection to the asteroid's tunnel network that the chitterlings had discovered. More of the creatures were pouring through this new entry point, threatening to overwhelm Mara and Ford from behind. "Fall back to evacuation point 7, Tal ordered, already moving toward the exit with his security detail. But Mara saw something the others didn't, a distinctive pattern in the chitterling movements, a coordinated attack strategy she recognized from studying previous engagements. "They're not just raiding," she called to Ford, gesturing toward the tunnel entrance. "This is a coordinated strike. That tunnel leads directly to the central chamber. They're trying to flank the Coalition's main defense line." Ford nodded his understanding, already adjusting his position to cover both entry points. "We need to collapse it. Seal them in." Mara glanced around the laboratory, her enhanced perception identifying potential resources with remarkable clarity. "The plasma cutter. If we overload it and drop it down the tunnel—" "On it," Ford confirmed, breaking from their defensive position to retrieve the industrial cutting tool from its station along the far wall. A chitterling leapt toward him, sensing his momentary vulnerability. But Mara intercepted it with 3 precise shots, dropping it mid-leap. "Everyone clear the laboratory," she shouted to the remaining staff. "Explosive decompression imminent." Tal hesitated at the exit, clearly torn between evacuation protocol and witnessing the outcome of this unexpected demonstration. "Captain Heron, you and Private Ford will withdraw immediately. That's an order." "With respect, Observer," Mara replied, not taking her eyes off the advancing chitterlings. "We'll be right behind you. But someone needs to trigger the collapse." Tal's mandibles clicked in what might have been frustration or resignation. 20 seconds, Captain. Then seal this section." As the last of the staff evacuated, Ford returned with the plasma cutter, its power core already glowing dangerously as he adjusted its settings beyond safety parameters. "Ready," he confirmed, his voice steady despite the fear chemicals still surging through his system. Together, they fought their way to the tunnel entrance, creating a momentary clearing in the wave of chitterling soldiers. Ford activated the cutter's overload sequence and dropped it into the tunnel. Then, they both turned and ran for the exit as the device's high-pitched whine reached critical levels. The explosion rocked the laboratory, sending equipment and debris flying as the plasma core detonated. The force threw Mara and Ford forward, through the exit door just as it sealed automatically behind them. They landed hard on the corridor floor, ears ringing from the blast. Through the reinforced viewport, they could see the laboratory collapsing inward, the tunnel entrance sealed by tons of debris and molten metal. Any chitterlings that had made it through were now cut off from their main force, and the Coalition's flank was secure. Mara struggled to her feet, offering Ford a hand up. The fear inducer was beginning to wear off, leaving them both shaky but functional, exactly as she had predicted. "Impressive," Observer Tal said, approaching them with Solvak close behind. "Most impressive indeed." "As you can see," Mara said, fighting to keep her voice steady as the chemical crash began. "The fear inducer approach provides comparable combat advantages without the neural risks of the interface technology." Solvak's expression was unreadable. "A single successful demonstration under chaotic conditions hardly constitutes scientific validation," Captain. Perhaps not, Tal interjected. But it does suggest a viable alternative worthy of consideration. He turned to Ford. Your performance was exceptional. Private. How do you feel now? Ford straightened to attention, though Mara could see the effort it cost him. Functional, sir. Tired but coherent. No neural disorientation like after the direct stimulation tests. Tal nodded thoughtfully, then addressed Mara. You've made your point, Captain. I will recommend further investigation of your approach for the strike team preparations. His compound eyes swiveled to Solvak. Both approaches will be evaluated. The more effective will be implemented. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was enough for now. Mara had bought Ford's life and opened the door for a more humane alternative to Solvak's neural mapping technology. As medical personnel arrived to check them for injuries, Ford caught Mara's eye. You knew, didn't you, about what they were really doing to me? I suspected, she admitted quietly. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you everything. You risked your career, your life. Ford's expression was solemn. Why? Mara thought of Ellen, of the sister she had lost to this war, and of the promise she had made at her memorial, to fight with honor, not just for victory. Because how we win matters as much as winning itself, she said finally. And because you deserved better than being sacrificed for a technology that might not even work. Ford nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. What happens now? Before Mara could answer, alarms blared throughout the evacuation corridor, a new, more urgent pattern that she recognized immediately. The Coalition's final defensive line had been breached. The chitterling Queen's forces were advancing on the central chamber of Artaros 9. The strike team would deploy within hours, ready or not. And Mara knew with sudden clarity that her demonstration, impressive as it had been, wouldn't be enough to convince Tal and Solvak to abandon their neural interface technology completely. They would still attempt to use it for the strike team, still sacrifice soldiers unnecessarily for a flawed approach. Unless she and Ford could prove beyond any doubt that the fear-inducer method was superior, by reaching the Queen's chamber themselves. The emergency evacuation of Artaros 9 was chaotic but orderly, Coalition training prevailing even in crisis. Personnel streamed toward the docking bays where transports waited to ferry them to the Aurora's edge and other Coalition vessels in orbit. Mara and Ford had been directed to Medical Transport 7, along with other injured personnel from the laboratory section. But as they approached the loading area, Mara pulled Ford aside into a maintenance alcove. We need to make a choice, she said quietly, checking to ensure they weren't overheard. Right now. Ford studied her face, understanding immediately that something significant had changed. What kind of choice? Tal authorized both approaches for evaluation, but I know Solvak. He'll push for his neural technology regardless of the risks. Mara's voice was urgent but controlled. The strike team deploys in less than 3 hours, and they'll be using neural interfaces that will burn them out before they can complete their mission. Unless we provide a more convincing demonstration, Ford concluded, his expression grim. You're talking about reaching the Queen's chamber ourselves, using the fear inducers. Mara nodded. It's a one-way mission either way, but with the fear inducers, at least there's a chance of survival. With Solvak's neural interfaces, there's none. And you want us to prove it. Ford's voice held no judgment, only a soldier's pragmatism. By beating the strike team to the target. I want to save lives, Mara corrected, including yours. But I won't order you to come with me. This has to be your choice. Ford was silent for a long moment, weighing the implications. Finally, he asked, do you have more of the fear-inducer compound? Rhea provided enough for 4 doses each, approximately 12 hours of enhanced function, with decreasing effectiveness as our bodies adapt. Mara pulled the injectors from her utility belt, where she had concealed them during the evacuation. But, Ford, You should know, even with the fear inducers, our chances of reaching the Queen's chamber alive are minimal. The tunnel network is overrun with chitterling forces. And if we do nothing, the strike team dies for certain. Ford finished. I've seen enough death in this war, Captain. I'm ready to try something different. Mara felt a surge of relief and gratitude. Then we need to move quickly. The evacuation will provide cover for us to reach the primary access tunnel to the central chamber. After that, we improvise, Ford said with a hint of a smile. Seems to be what humans do best, according to your research. They made their way through the evacuation crowds, using Mara's officer credentials to requisition combat gear from a supply depot. Standard-issue weapons would be insufficient against the Queen's elite guard, but Mara had another solution in mind, one that required a detour to the weapons development section before it was completely evacuated. Lieutenant Kendis was overseeing the final equipment transfer when they arrived. Her pupils contracted in surprise at the sight of them. Captain, you should be on Medical Transport 7 by now. Her gaze shifted to their combat gear. What are you doing? What needs to be done? Mara replied. I need access to the prototype weapons vault. Authorization code Heron Delta 93. Ria's expression shifted from confusion to understanding, then to concern. The strike team deployment. You're going to try to reach the Queen first. With the fear inducer protocol. Yes. Mara held the lieutenant's gaze. You can try to stop us, or you can help us save the strike team from Solvak's neural death sentence. Ria hesitated only briefly before moving to a nearby console. Authorization granted, but Captain, you should know, Tal has already left for the frigate. Solvak remains to oversee the strike team's final preparations. If you're caught, then make sure we're not caught, Mara said simply. Can you delay the strike team deployment? Give us a head start. Ria's pupils contracted to near-invisible slits, the Senrian expression of extreme stress or conflict. Finally, she nodded. I can create a calibration error in their equipment. 1 hour, maybe 2 at most. It will have to be enough. Mara clasped the lieutenant's shoulder briefly. Thank you, Ria. Don't thank me yet, Ria replied grimly. I'll transmit the Queen's chamber coordinates to your tactical display. But after that, you're on your own. All automated defense systems have been compromised by the chitterling advance. As Ria worked at her console, Ford examined the prototype weapons with professional interest. What exactly are we looking for, Captain? These, Mara said, retrieving 2 compact devices from a secured case. Molecular disruptors, still experimental, but effective against chitterling armor at close range. They'll burn out after about 20 discharges, but they're our best chance against the Queen's Guard. Ford accepted one of the weapons, testing its unfamiliar weight and balance. How close is close range? Closer than you'd like, Mara admitted. But with the fear inducers enhancing our reflexes, we should be able to get within effective distance. Coordinates transmitted, Ria announced. The most direct route to the Queen's chamber is through Maintenance Tunnel E7, but it's likely heavily guarded. There's a secondary approach through the geothermal regulation system, but the environmental conditions are extreme. The geothermal route, Mara decided immediately. The chitterlings don't handle heat variations well. It might give us an edge. Then you'll need these, Ria said, retrieving specialized environmental suits from a nearby locker. They're rated for the temperatures you'll encounter, but they'll restrict movement somewhat. As they donned the protective gear, Mara felt a moment of doubt. Was she leading Ford and herself to certain death? The rational part of her mind calculated their chances at less than 20%. But another part, the part that had joined this war to protect worlds like Earth from the chitterling threat, knew this was their best hope. The evacuation is nearly complete, Ria informed them, checking her monitor. You have approximately 10 minutes before security protocols seal all access to the central tunnels. Mara nodded, securing the last of her equipment. Lieutenant, if we don't return, I'll ensure the truth about Solvak's research is known, Rhea promised. And about what you tried to do here. It was as much as Mara could hope for. She turned to Ford. Ready? He injected himself with the fear-inducer compound, his expression hardening as the chemicals took effect. Ready, Captain. Together, they moved out, leaving the relative safety of the evacuation zone and heading into the heart of Artaros 9, and toward the waiting Chitterling Queen. The geothermal tunnels beneath Artaros 9's primary chambers were a hellscape of superheated steam and toxic mineral deposits. Even with the environmental suits, the heat was nearly unbearable, seeping through the insulation to raise blisters on exposed skin. But Mara had been right about one thing. The Chitterling presence here was minimal, limited to occasional scout pairs that they dispatched quickly and silently. The aliens' physiology wasn't designed for these conditions, their exoskeletons becoming brittle in the extreme heat. For nearly 2 hours, they navigated the treacherous passage, guided by Rhea's coordinates and the faint energy signature of the Queen's chamber on their tactical displays. The fear-inducer compounds kept them hyper-alert, their bodies functioning at peak efficiency despite the environmental challenges. How much further? Ford asked during a brief rest at a junction point, his voice muffled by his rebreather mask. Mara checked the tactical display. We're approaching the outer perimeter of the Queen's sanctum. The geothermal tunnel ends about 300 meters ahead. After that, we're in Chitterling territory proper, Ford finished. Right into the heart of the hive. Mara nodded, studying his face for signs of doubt or hesitation. Finding none, she felt a surge of respect for this farmer-turned-soldier who had shown more courage than many career officers she had known. We should take another dose of the fear-inducer before we proceed, she suggested, retrieving the injectors from her belt pouch. Maximum effectiveness for the final approach. As the chemicals flooded her system once more, Mara felt the now familiar rush of hyper-awareness, her senses expanding to encompass every detail of their surroundings. She could hear the subtle shifts in the steam flow patterns, feel the minute vibrations in the tunnel floor that signaled movement somewhere ahead. Something's wrong, she whispered, holding up a hand to halt Ford's advance. The vibration patterns are irregular. Too many convergence points. Ford frowned, placing his palm against the tunnel wall to feel the tremors himself. Troop movements? No, this is different. More like... Mara's eyes widened as realization struck. Structural instability. The Chitterling advance has damaged the asteroid's support systems. As if to confirm her assessment, a violent shudder ran through the tunnel, dislodging fragments of rock and mineral from the ceiling. The tactical display flickered, then stabilized with new warning indicators. The central chamber is experiencing progressive collapse, Mara reported, reading the data with mounting concern. The coalition's defensive bombardment must have weakened the outer shell more than they realized. How long before total structural failure? Ford asked, his voice calm despite the implications. Mara shook her head. Hours, maybe less. But that's not our immediate problem. She pointed to the tactical display, where dozens of Chitterling signatures were suddenly converging on the tunnel ahead. They're evacuating the lower chambers, coming right toward us. Ford checked his weapons with practiced efficiency. Options. We can't turn back. The evac is complete. All access points sealed. Mara considered rapidly, the fear-inducer sharpening her strategic thinking. And we can't stay here. The collapse will reach these tunnels soon. So we go forward, Ford concluded. Through them. Through them, Mara agreed. But not head-on. Look. She indicated a maintenance shaft on the tactical display, barely large enough for a person to navigate. This runs parallel to the main tunnel, emerges just outside the Queen's antechamber. If we can reach it before the Chitterling evacuation front arrives. They moved with renewed urgency, pushing their enhanced bodies to the limit as they raced against both the approaching Chitterling forces and the asteroid's increasing instability. The maintenance shaft proved to be even more constricted than the display had suggested, a claustrophobic tube barely wider than their shoulders, forcing them to crawl through superheated darkness with only the faint glow of their tactical displays for illumination. After what seemed like hours, but was likely only minutes, Mara's display indicated they were approaching the exit point. She paused, listening intently for any sound of Chitterling activity beyond the shaft wall. "Clear?" Ford whispered behind her. "Unclear," she replied honestly. "Too much interference from the structural vibrations. We'll have to risk it." With careful precision, she disengaged the maintenance panel at the shaft's end, easing it open just enough to peer into the chamber beyond. What she saw made her breath catch. They had indeed reached the antechamber to the Queen's sanctum, a vast, cathedral-like space carved from the asteroid's core, its walls lined with the distinctive resin structures that served as Chitterling incubation chambers. But the space was in chaos. Chitterling soldiers rushing in all directions as sections of the ceiling collapsed around them. And at the far end, a massive doorway of crystalline material stood open, leading to the inner sanctum itself. "The Queen's chamber is accessible," Mara whispered to Ford. "But the antechamber is swarming with guards, at least 30 that I can see." Ford processed this information, then asked the crucial question. "Any sign of the strike team?" Mara scanned the chamber again, looking for any indication of coalition forces. "None. We might still be ahead of them. Or they never made it this far," Ford suggested grimly. Either possibility meant the same thing. They were the only chance to complete the mission, to end the war. "We'll need a distraction," Mara said, thinking rapidly. "Something to draw the guards away from the sanctum entrance." Ford was silent for a moment, then said, "The environmental controls." "What about them?" Mara asked, following his gaze to a control panel on the chamber's far wall. "If we can trigger an emergency purge in the adjacent sections, they'll have to respond. Chitterlings always prioritize brood protection over everything else." Mara studied the chamber layout on her tactical display. "We'd need to cross 20 meters of exposed space to reach that panel." "Not if we use these," Ford replied, retrieving what looked like small metal discs from his utility belt. "Sonic disruptors, standard for tunnel clearing. If I can get the right angle." Mara nodded her understanding. "Do it." Ford calibrated the disruptors with quick, precise movements, his fear-enhanced reflexes making the delicate work look effortless. When he was satisfied, he positioned himself at the edge of the maintenance shaft opening. "On 3, he whispered. 1, 2, 3. He hurled the discs with perfect accuracy, sending them arcing across the chamber to land precisely at the base of the environmental control panel. A moment later, they detonated with a high-pitched shriek that made Mara wince despite her helmet's sound dampening. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The control panel exploded in a shower of sparks, triggering emergency protocols throughout the chamber. Alarm signals, designed specifically for Chitterling sensory organs, pulsed through the area, causing the guards to abandon their positions and rush toward the brood chambers in the adjacent sections. "Now!" Mara hissed, and they burst from the maintenance shaft, sprinting across the antechamber toward the crystalline doorway. Their fear-enhanced bodies moved with preternatural speed, covering the distance in seconds. They were halfway to the sanctum entrance when the first Chitterling guard spotted them. It let out a piercing alarm call, alerting the others to the intruders in their midst. 3 guards broke away from the evacuation effort, their serrated limbs extended as they moved to intercept. "Keep going!" Ford shouted, skidding to a halt and bringing up his molecular disruptor. "I'll hold them off." Mara wanted to protest, to insist they stay together. But the mission logic was undeniable. One of them needed to reach the Queen. She gave Ford a quick nod and continued her sprint toward the sanctum entrance. Behind her, she heard the distinctive whine of the molecular disruptor activating, followed by the shrill cry of a chitterling soldier as its molecular structure was temporarily destabilized. Ford was buying her time with his life. She reached the crystalline doorway just as a violent tremor shook the chamber, causing massive chunks of ceiling to crash down among the fleeing chitterlings. The asteroid's collapse was accelerating. They had minutes at most before the entire structure would become unstable. Mara paused at the threshold, looking back to see Ford fighting his way toward her, the molecular disruptor glowing hot in his hands as he dispatched a fourth guard. Their eyes met across the chaos of the antechamber, and he gave her a quick nod before turning to face two more approaching guards. Taking a deep breath, Mara stepped through the doorway into the Queen's sanctum. The chamber beyond defied all expectations. Unlike the utilitarian hive structures of the outer tunnels, the Queen's sanctum was a marvel of alien architecture, a vast dome of crystalline material that caught and refracted the bioluminescent light from thousands of egg sacs suspended from the ceiling. The air was thick with pheromones and biochemical markers, creating an atmosphere that made Mara's head swim despite her helmet's filtration. And at the center, on a raised dais of polished chitin, sat the chitterling queen. She was enormous, easily 5 times the size of her soldiers, with an elongated thorax that pulsed rhythmically as it produced the eggs that would become the next wave of the horde. Her carapace shimmered with iridescent patterns that Mara recognized as status markers and command sigils, a living communication system that controlled her vast armies across multiple star systems. Around the Queen, a circle of elite guards stood at attention, larger and more heavily armored than any chitterling soldiers Mara had encountered before. They turned as one at her entrance, their compound eyes fixing on the human intruder with predatory focus. Mara raised her molecular disruptor, knowing it would be insufficient against so many elite guards, but determined to complete the mission even at the cost of her life. The fear-inducer compound surged through her system, heightening her senses to an almost painful degree as she prepared for what would surely be her final battle. But before either she or the guards could move, another tremor, more violent than any before, rocked the chamber. Massive cracks appeared in the crystalline dome, and several of the egg sacs detached from the ceiling, crashing to the floor with wet, sickening sounds. The Queen emitted a high-pitched keening that Mara's translator interpreted as distress and command combined. The elite guards responded immediately, moving not toward Mara, but to the Queen herself, forming a protective circle as pieces of the dome continued to fall around them. Mara recognized the opportunity and took it, sprinting forward with her disruptor raised. If she could get close enough to the Queen, one shot might be enough to end the war, to prevent countless more deaths on both sides. She was halfway across the chamber when a familiar voice called her name. "Captain Heron!" Mara turned to see Observer Tal entering the sanctum, accompanied by a full coalition strike team in advanced combat gear. Solvac's neural interface technology evident in the glowing connections at their temples. Ford was with them, being supported by 2 coalition soldiers, his face pale but determined. "Observer," Mara acknowledged, not lowering her weapon. "You're late." Tal's compound eyes swiveled between Mara and the chitterling Queen, who remained surrounded by her guards as the chamber continued to disintegrate around them. "How did you reach the sanctum before us?" he demanded. The strike team had clear passage through the main tunnels after the chitterling forces began evacuating. "The geothermal route," Mara explained briefly. "As I suggested in my initial assessment." Understanding flickered across Tal's features. "The fear-inducer protocol. You've been using it all along." "Successfully," Mara confirmed. "While your strike team was being fitted with neural interfaces that would have burned them out before they even reached this chamber." One of the strike team soldiers stumbled suddenly, clutching his head in obvious agony. Then another fell to his knees, the neural interface at his temple sparking dangerously. It's beginning already, Mara said grimly. The neural degradation Solvac knew would happen, but didn't tell you about. Tall's mandibles clicked in what might have been anger or dismay. Is this true? The neural interfaces are failing? They were always going to fail, Ford spoke up, his voice weak but clear. That was the plan, a suicide mission disguised as a technological breakthrough. Another violent tremor interrupted them. Larger pieces of the dome crashing down around the increasingly frantic Queen and her guards. The entire asteroid was approaching critical structural failure. We don't have time for this, Mara said urgently. The Queen is vulnerable. We can end this war now, but we need to move quickly. Tal hesitated only briefly before making his decision. Disable the neural interfaces, he ordered the remaining functional members of the strike team. Switch to standard combat protocols. As the soldiers hurried to comply, Mara turned her attention back to the Queen. The elite guards had begun to move her toward a previously hidden exit at the rear of the sanctum, an escape route that would allow her to flee the collapsing asteroid. We can't let her escape, Mara told Tal. If she reaches another hive cluster, the war continues. Agreed, Tal replied. But a frontal assault against those elite guards would be suicide, even with our combined forces. Ford, who had been quietly studying the chamber while the others spoke, suddenly straightened. The dome, he said, pointing upward. The structural supports are failing in sequence. If we could accelerate that process... Mara followed his gaze, immediately understanding his plan. We target the remaining support columns. Bring the whole thing down on top of them. Cutting off their escape route in the process, Tal concluded, mandibles clicking in approval. Precision fire on the marked locations, he ordered the strike team, indicating the critical structural points on their tactical displays. As the coalition soldiers took up positions around the chamber, Mara moved to Ford's side. You should evacuate with the wounded, she told him. You've done enough. Ford shook his head stubbornly. Not until it's finished. I didn't come this far to miss the end. Before Mara could argue further, Ta'al gave the order to fire. The combined firepower of the strike team's weapons, along with Mara and Ford's molecular disruptors, struck the support columns simultaneously. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groaning sound that seemed to come from the asteroid itself, the crystalline dome began to collapse. The Queen's keening rose to a deafening pitch as her guards frantically tried to shield her from the falling debris. The hidden exit was already blocked by massive crystalline shards, cutting off their escape. Fall back, Tal ordered, as larger sections of the dome gave way. Return to the antechamber. The chain reaction will complete the mission. The strike team retreated in good order, helping their neural-damaged comrades through the crystalline doorway. Mara and Ford followed, pausing at the threshold to look back at the destruction they had wrought. The Queen was now completely trapped, her enormous body partially crushed beneath the fallen dome, her guards dying around her as they made futile attempts to shield her from the inevitable. It's over, Ford said quietly. She can't survive that? Mara nodded, a complex mix of emotions washing through her. Relief, grief, exhaustion, and something like hollow victory. Let's go home, she said, taking Ford's arm to help support him as they turned away from the dying Queen. The evacuation from Artaros 9 was chaotic, but successful. As the last coalition ships broke orbit, the asteroid's structural integrity finally failed completely, the hollow world imploding in a spectacular display that was visible from light years away. With it died the chitterling Queen and her brood, the heart of the horde that had threatened coalition space for years. Intelligence reports from across the front confirmed what they had hoped. Without the Queen's direct control, the remaining chitterling forces had fallen into disarray, their coordinated attacks dissolving into isolated skirmishes that coalition forces could contain and eliminate. The war wasn't over, not completely, but its turning point had come. Aboard the Aurora's Edge, in the quiet of the medical bay, Mara sat beside Ford's recovery bed. His injuries from the battle in the Queen's antechamber had been severe, but not life-threatening, and the medical staff expected a full recovery within weeks. "They're calling you a hero, you know," she told him, gesturing to the ship's information feeds where news of their mission had spread rapidly. "The farmer who helped slay the Queen." Ford smiled weakly. "And what are they calling you?" "Insubordinate, mostly," Mara replied with a wry smile. "Observer Tall is still deciding whether to recommend me for commendation or court-martial. For saving his strike team from neural collapse? That seems ungrateful. For disobeying direct orders, stealing experimental compounds, and endangering a valuable test subject." Mara's expression grew serious. "Solvak is particularly insistent about the last one. He still believes his neural interface technology could have worked with further refinement." Ford snorted. "Further refinement of my fried brain, you mean?" "Exactly. Which is why I've submitted my resignation from the Xenobiology Division." At Ford's surprised look, she continued, "I can't be part of a research program that views sentient beings as disposable resources. Not anymore." "What will you do instead?" Mara hesitated, then revealed the decision she had been contemplating since their return. "I've requested assignment to Earth as a liaison officer for the Coalition's ongoing integration efforts." "Earth," Ford repeated, a hint of longing in his voice. "I haven't been home in over a year. Not since conscription." "I know." Mara reached into her pocket and withdrew a small data chip. "Which is why I arranged this. Medical discharge and transportation orders. You're going home, Private Ford." Ford stared at the chip in disbelief. "How did you—" "Observer Tall may be conflicted about my methods, but he recognizes results, and he agreed that you've more than fulfilled your service obligation to the Coalition." She placed the chip in his hand. "The transport leaves tomorrow. Medical staff will accompany you to ensure your recovery continues smoothly." Ford closed his fingers around the chip, his expression a mix of gratitude and something more complex. "What about you? When do you leave for Earth?" "In a few weeks, after the debriefings are complete." Mara stood to leave, suddenly uncomfortable with the emotions rising within her, attachment, concern, and possibilities she hadn't allowed herself to consider during wartime. "I should let you rest." As she turned to go, Ford caught her hand. "When you get to Earth," he said quietly, "look me up. Topeka Repair Yard. Can't miss it." His smile was tentative but genuine. "I might even let you drive the tractor." Mara found herself smiling back, the weight of the past days lifting slightly at the prospect of a future beyond war and difficult choices. "I'd like that," she replied, squeezing his hand briefly before letting go. Outside in the corridor, Mara paused to look through the viewport at the stars, unchanged and indifferent to the conflicts that raged among them. Somewhere out there, Earth waited, a blue-green marble of hope and new beginnings, but also of challenge. The knowledge they had gained about human biochemistry would change how the Coalition, and the galaxy, viewed her species forever. Humans would be seen as both potential weapons and valuable allies, their unique physiology marking them as different in ways that would have far-reaching implications. Mara touched the small metal tag hanging from the chain around her neck. Ellen's identification, a reminder of what was lost and what still remained to be protected. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same determination that had carried her through the tunnels of Artaros 9 and into the heart of the enemy. And perhaps, for the first time since joining this war, she would not face it alone. Weeks later, the Aurora's edge dropped out of warp above the blue-green marble of Earth, its surface forever changed by what it would now face. As Mara prepared for planetfall, she looked out at the world below, Jace Ford's world, soon to be her home as well, and wondered what challenges awaited them in this new chapter of human and coalition history. But that was a story for another day. For now, she had a tractor to learn to drive and a promise to keep.